There are many people out there these days that can be very quick to get very angry about a lot of what they perceive to be problems in the world today. But the key word there is perceive, because I observe those people making at least two very big mistakes, one of which feeds into the other, and they are identifying a problem where it doesn't really exist, right? Thinking something's wrong when it really isn't, and furthermore, assuming that by virtue of having identified that problem, that the first solution that pops into their head, that their emotions compel them to conceive, is the best solution that could possibly exist. But as you might have guessed, I think that you've got to put a hell of a lot more thought into both of those before you can really start complaining about anything. And so that's what I'm going to take a look at in this video. So if ever you observe something happen and you want to believe that it's a problem, I'd say there are at least 3 different questions you got to ask yourself before you can jump to that conclusion. And they are, number 1, did it happen for the reason that you think it did? Number 2, what's the frequency of it? Does it happen a lot, or is it just a one-time thing? And number 3, what's the severity of it? Is it really a big deal or not so much? So taking those one at a time, sometimes in the heat of the moment when something bad happens, at least as we perceive it, it's very easy to jump to the worst possible conclusion as far as why it happened and assume the most morally reprehensible reason. But you have to remember that what happened and why it happened are 2 very different, mutually exclusive things. And one is not true by virtue of the other. So for example, if I'm at a restaurant and I'm not getting my food fast enough, then it's very easy for me to blame the waiter and think of the worst possible reason that I can and say that it's because he just doesn't like me for some superficial reason. And so now that just makes the problem seem 10 times worse. But the reality is, if I just stop and took a deep breath and took a look around me, I'd probably see that the same thing is happening to everybody else. And it's probably not because he doesn't like me, but instead because it's rush hour at the restaurant or something like that, which really makes all the difference in the world between one problem and another. Now, the frequency with which something happens is also a very important determiner in how serious of a problem it really is. Because if one thing happens one time, then it's probably really not that big of a deal and you can just brush it off and move on with your life. It's really not worth it in that case. Now, if it happens a few times, that's still not enough because there could be other far worse problems that happen much more frequently that really are deserving of your attention. And so this is why statistics, in part, are very important to understand. But you also have to be careful of how you interpret statistics because they can be very misleading. So just to name a few examples, sometimes you might hear someone say that event A occurs much less frequently than event B, but event A occurs at a much higher rate than event B, and so therefore it's a problem. But you got to ask yourself, how much does the rate of something really mean if the numbers, comparatively speaking, stack up where they are in absolute terms? And the answer is it really doesn't mean anything. So it's likely that that person has an ulterior motive and they're just trying to scare you into following or supporting whatever political cause they have or something like that. Another example is to consider the complement of the statistics that you might hear. So you might hear how often something does happen, but you also have to be aware of how often it doesn't happen. So if you hear something like there were 10 motorcycle-related fatalities in the last month, then that might make you feel like anybody that gets on a motorcycle is just doomed. And that's just the way it is because of those statistics. But you have to consider at the same time, how many people get on motorcycles every day and nothing happens to them? So it's probably not as serious as a problem as it might seem. And finally, don't forget to take into account the severity of whatever so-called problem it is that you're choosing to fixate on. Because sometimes, even if it happens for the reason that you think it does, and it happens as frequently as you think it does, it's still not really that big of a deal. And we choose to fix it on trivial things a lot of the time. So to take a bit of a more comprehensive example from start to finish, sometimes people act like getting pulled over is the worst thing that could ever happen to them because they assume inaccurately that, number 1, it happened for the most morally reprehensible reason they can think of, such as them being discriminated against or being singled out. They assume that those one-off things happen much more often than they do, especially because they get highlighted in the news all the time. And finally, to top it all off, like I said, they act like getting pulled over is the most emotionally traumatizing thing that a human being could ever possibly have to go through. But the reason I find myself disagreeing with those people is because, going back to the reasoning, they act like it's impossible for the person getting pulled over to ever do anything wrong, which of course isn't the case. We're all imperfect and we all drive over the speed limit and run stop signs every once in a while. And so it's likely that the reason people are getting pulled over is legitimate rather than what they might think. And when you hear about something in the news and it gets that national attention because those one-off things do happen sometimes, it makes us think that it happens much more often than it really does. But the reality is that the number of times people get pulled over and nothing noteworthy comes of it is a much higher number. You just don't hear about it because, like I said, nothing noteworthy comes of it, so it's not really worthy of those national headlines. But that doesn't mean that it never happens. But to top it all off, again, like I said, they act like getting pulled over is the most emotionally traumatic thing that you could ever go through. But it's really not. There are far worse things you could be faced in life, so it's really not that big of a deal. Worst case scenario, you get a ticket, if not a warning, and then you move on with your life. Now, just because you've identified a problem, that doesn't mean by virtue of that, whatever solution you propose is going to work, because you have to put a lot more thought into that as well, like I said. So you have to ask yourself at a minimum, number one, how is that solution going to solve the problem rather than making it worse? And number two, what are the consequences of that solution? Because every solution has some consequences. How are we going to mitigate them or accept them if we can't do that? So if you don't think about the first thing and you can't articulate what your metrics are for success, is it the health of the economy? In which case, how do you measure that? Is it GDP or median income or something like that? Is it happiness? In which case, many people already have what they need to be happy and they still aren't. So how do you really quantify that, much less achieve it? So if you can't think about all those things, then you might stand to either not make progress at all or furthermore make the problem worse. So if, for example, you say that everybody in Group A is evil and oppresses everybody in Group B and everybody in Group B is just a victim, then what are you really going to accomplish by just talking about that all the time? You're going to force people to identify with their group identities rather than their individual identities, and you're just going to keep reminding them that they're either evil or that they're victims, and there's nothing they can do about that. So ironically, in the name of trying to mitigate divisiveness, you're just creating more of it. Now, the consequences of your solution are also very important to be aware of, because that illuminates for you whether the solution you're proposing is any better than the other ones out there, because there are always multiple solutions to any given problem. Or furthermore, if you're creating more consequences or worse consequences than already were being created by the original problem to begin with. So going back to the traffic stop example, sometimes people try to argue that because we hate getting pulled over, we just need to abolish the police entirely and just get rid of them. But if you look around at places in the country that are already doing that, you'll see the consequences of it firsthand. And it's nothing short of skyrocketing crime rates and just all-out lawlessness. So that's not really a very viable option, at least from that perspective, in my opinion. We need the police whether we like it or not, so you're going to have to come up with a much better solution than that. So to summarize, don't be so quick to identify problems where they don't really even exist. And furthermore, assume that whatever solution pops in your head to those supposed problems is the best solution that could ever possibly exist. Because you have to put a lot more thought into it than that if you want to solve anything, and furthermore, if you want to have any credibility. So hope that changes your mind. Let me know if it does, and I'll see you next time.